Affairs channel.
From Monash University, Madeline Schultz. From the University of Western Australia, Jeremy Rich. And also from the University of Western Australia, Daniel Kirkby. And finally, from the University of Melbourne, Tim Blair. As is customary, the teams have had half an hour to prepare from a choice of 3 topics. The 2 topics that the teams did not choose were that governments should not give native title rights to Indigenous groups that do not democratically choose their leaders. The other rejected motion was that it should be illegal to publicly argue that the stolen generation was justified or beneficial. The motion, and you guys have probably guessed the theme, that both grand finalist teams chose to debate was that the Northern Territory should be made an autonomous Indigenous nation within the Commonwealth of Australia. The debate will be timed by Tom Ashby. Without any further ado, to open the case for USU 1, I'd like to invite Steph White.
From the original Declaration of Terra Nullius to the Howard administration's incredibly offensively paternalistic Northern Territory intervention, the Australian Indigenous people have been consistently oppressed and stripped of their rights. We must compensate them for this oppression, and returning land is the only appropriate way to do it. The Northern Territory must be made an autonomous Indigenous nation. The model we will be presenting from Affirmative is quite simple. The Northern Territory will secede from Australia, and control will be vested in the Indigenous people who live there. We will allow those people full autonomy in terms of the domestic affairs within that state, including how they form a system of government. The Indigenous people there can determine the system of government they wish. We think broadly that will be democratic, but will have large space for local tribes to make decisions in terms of local affairs. The Australian government will fully nationalise the white ownership of land and compensate people for the taking of mines and industry in those areas. The Australian government will reserve rights over foreign policy because they're within the Commonwealth of Australia. This debate is about domestic issues within that area. Economically, we think the Australian government can provide large amounts of aid in the same way we do to our regional partners at the moment, which we have even less of an interest in. So, I'll be bringing you 2 issues in this debate. Firstly, why this is the only way to appropriately compensate for white colonisation and its subsequent damage, and secondly, why this will increase the quality of life for Indigenous people there. So on to this first issue of why this is the only appropriate way to compensate for white colonisation and all the shit we've done afterwards. So, firstly, why is it important that this compensation happens? The Australian government has done systematic injustice to the Indigenous people ever since colonisation. From Terra Nullius, where we declared that they were not people and took the land from them, to the paternalistic policies of governments making judgments on behalf of the Indigenous people, such as the stolen generation, through to the full-scale occupation of the Northern Territory by the federal government to reduce autonomy in the Northern Territory intervention. So, we think it's pretty clear we've taken their rights. We don't particularly like that on the affirmative. So, to the second part of this point, of why future generations are morally liable for the crimes of past governments, and therefore why this government has an obligation to compensate for what past governments have done. Firstly, because every single person living in Australian society at the moment are the beneficiaries of that injustice, are the beneficiaries of the oppression that we have done to the Indigenous people. The land that we hold this debate on, we stole from Indigenous people. We think it's about time we compensated them for that. Secondly, we think there is a continuity of generations and a continuity of governments. We don't think you can draw a clear line between generations and say where culpability ends. Thirdly, we think the choice to disenfranchise Indigenous people and oppress them in such a way was a bipartisan choice made by the whole of society. It wasn't something that had opposition. Fourthly, this is not a purely historical issue, right? We were all alive for the Northern Territory intervention. It is something that we have done now and we are culpable for. Therefore, that means that we are happy to take away the rights of white people in order to do this. Third part of this point. Why do we do it in this form? Why do we do it with land rights? Why do we give them an autonomous nation? Firstly, that is what was taken. We declared terra nullius. We said that they weren't human. We said that it was okay to take their land. The way to compensate that is to give land back. Secondly, we think land rights are inherently tied to the autonomy of the Indigenous people, saying that they could use the space in the way that they want. This is particularly true for the Indigenous people, who form narratives around the use of their land and find that especially important to the autonomy. We took away their autonomy. This is the appropriate way to give it back. We think any other gesture is simply going to be that, a symbolic gesture, monetary compensation, that sort of thing, an apology is not good enough. Fourth part of this point, why current native title arrangements are inadequate. Firstly, the claims are rare because of the incredibly high burdens of the legal test for proving a continuous association with that land. Because these claims are so costly to bring in the legal system, in that the person who is defending it against you is a mining company with shitloads of money to buy expensive lawyers. We think these claims are rare, rarely brought, and rarely succeed. Secondly, even when those claims do succeed, they are on the terms of the oppressor. They are people trying to buy into a white narrative of white law. We don't think we should impose that on the Indigenous people. We shouldn't try and align Indigenous conceptions of property rights with white conceptions of property rights. We think we do it in this way. Why is the Northern Territory appropriate? Because they have the most established claim with the largest Indigenous population, because they have the most connection to that land in the most preserved way, and there has been the least white imposition there. So on to my second argument, which is about why this will increase the quality of life for the Indigenous people living in this area. We think this applies to Indigenous people who currently live there and the people that will move there. Why will people move there? Because firstly, we don't think Indigenous people particularly like living under white oppression, and when given the opportunity to live in their own autonomous state, we're pretty sure they'll do that. But secondly, we think the sense of Indigenous community and connection across the Indigenous community is a consequence of white colonisation bringing them together against that key enemy, and also the positive development of that community by giving them their own land will be something that they will want to opt into. Faz will be talking to you more about identity. This means that they will continue to have connections to land, but they'll be able to do that in a more community-based way when they have their own land. So, second part of this argument, about why they should have choice, why their living conditions will be improved when they have choice over their style of government. Because they are removed from the democratic tyranny of the white people who, as 98% of the population being non-Indigenous, dictate to them what rights they should have and how they should live in society. Because they are always going to be structurally disadvantaged as being 2% of our population. They are always going to be oppressed in that way. We think that when they have the ability to make better control over their own policies, govern themselves in that way, they will have better policies more suited to them. We think currently there is no political voice which leads to repressive policies, and that is problematic. We think that things like the oppression that comes with our legal system that is geared towards structurally disadvantaging Indigenous people by a policing system which is racially discriminatory, which has over-policing Indigenous areas, that will end. The way that you have Indigenous people drawn into cycles of crime by over-policing, drawn into cycles of crime by having that happening in their communities, that will not happen when you don't have a racist system and a racist government telling them what is good for them. We think we give them a political voice, and we think we remove the paternalistic policies which have been so problematic for the Indigenous people. Thirdly, We think this will help Indigenous people bring back practices which are very important to them and which have been restricted by the white community. Things like corroboree ceremonies, things like male and female initiations, the kind of practices that don't happen at the moment but will under our model. So what's the mechanism? Why don't they happen currently? They don't happen currently because you don't have a critical mass of people who are available to do those ceremonies and support those ceremonies. Also, they're not made available because you have a white man's law controlling the way they happen. We are very happy on the affirmative to say we took their land, we should give it back. We're very happy to say that when we systematically remove their rights, we should compensate them for that. Land rights is the appropriate way to do it. The Northern Territory should become an autonomous region with their own government, and it's pretty much time we gave them their own land back. We're very proud to propose.